graduated, elevated. Now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves, take it to the top one time non-stop.
Hello, Kyle, and welcome to Ph.D. Hardtalk. Thank you so much for wanting to spend 30 minutes of your time, roughly, with me. It might be an hour, but please do introduce your research to the world.
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kyle Shupe. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cincinnati in Cincinnati, Ohio in the United States. I consider myself a scholar of gender, masculinity, and sexuality, and my dissertation research is examining the surveillance of cruising and public sex among men who have sex with men in the local context here.
I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. So firstly, how does your research help everybody that's out in the community? How does it help us as individuals?
I think this is a good question because it's sort of the so what? Why should we care about the project? And fundamentally, I think that my work is speaking to sort of the lengths the public, whoever we imagine that to be, will allow police to go to surveil certain types of criminal activity. In my instance, studying public sex, which is largely victimless crime. Here, for instance, we've had city police blocking public access to parks in order to prevent vehicles from getting in, so these men couldn't do it, right? So prohibiting access to public space, so a few people couldn't use it, preventing the vast majority from using it in the same, in different sort of ways. I think the project speaks to these ideas of who is public space for and what activities are allowed to be seen or known about in public, and what types of sexuality, whether that be the expression, in the case of my research, right, actual sex in public, or less immediate forms, whether that be a couple holding hands or kissing, right? In the discourse that I see, we often hear things like parks are places for children and families, right? And that's sexualized, it's heterosexualized, right? So we don't interpret it as being sexually deviant because it's the right way to be in a society that is heterosexist. So fundamentally, I think the project is speaking to this idea of what happens when queer people want to be queer in public space, and to what degree are they allowed to do so? Okay,
so in terms of current situation, we know that is for families. However, over the past, I like to think from the 90s, actually, there's been a movement to say, you know, everybody deserves the same level of respect in the sense of PDA, etc. Well, actual sex, I can't even speak, actual sex for heterosexual couples as well in the park, you can get into trouble.
Yeah, that's correct. It's unclear to the extent, based on the data I have and the people I have access to what degree people are differently policed based on the gender of the people they're having sex with, or if police are like unfairly targeting men who are having sex with men. That's not clear. It's also unclear to the degree which heterosexual couples versus men who have sex with men are having sex in public parks. That's not really unknown. It's sort of a black box in the project. And that's something I intend to attempt to investigate, but given the sort of illegal activity, it might be hard to actually come down to find out what exactly the sort of public sex scene in that case actually looks like in the city. So I focus on the outcomes. Who does get arrested? What do we see happening without really knowing what the sort of scope would be on the front end of that?
Okay, so what age group are you looking at? Is it everybody from like 20 going to 60, 65, 80, or is it 25 to 35? What's the age group?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, right, when studying sex, you have to be careful about who the populations are. So obviously, this is people 18 plus. These are adults who are under the study. I've never encountered, or at least I don't think I have, based on the research I've done thus far, encountered anyone who was a minor. However, that said, there are people who range from 18, and I've seen people up to their 80s who are participating in some way. My agreement to do this research with the university's Institutional Review Board has barred me from collecting demographic data to prevent the sort of revelation of people's identities, and so we can't trace them back. So I do the best I can to sort of, I have an idea of who these people are, but I have to primarily focus on the activities themselves and the sort of police engagement with them, because the people are in some ways off limits to me based on how the university has allowed me to conduct this research.
Okay, I think that's interesting. I was going to ask the question, you know, which demographics, you know, in terms of ethnicity, etc. But that's perfectly fine. And I was going to go into religion as well. So we'll leave that because, you know,
yeah,
you're not
I can speak to a bit based on my impressions of what I've gotten. I just don't have a sort of clear, this is the pattern that the data reveals to me. But yeah, so in terms of age, right, we see a full range of 18 to as long as you're alive participating. My understanding is that men tend to be in their late 30s, early 40s, maybe into their 50s, who are primarily participating in this activity. And given the sort of racial demographics of the city, it's almost 50-50 a black-white split. We see people of both of these races and also other races that are present in the city participating as well.
That's quite interesting. You know, from a religious perspective, do you ask, you know, their religious background as well?
Religion isn't something I'm particularly interested in as a scholar. The city itself is a sort of Catholic founded city, and that has played out, and we see the sort of sexual politics of the city. In the, I think, 80s, a Robert Mapplethorpe exhibit, he's a gay photographer who exhibits male nudes, his work was brought to our local art museum, sparking a huge backlash in the city, and ultimately an obscenity trial determining if this was the public exhibiting pornography on the taxpayer's dime. So it's unclear what is going on in my field site with this sort of information in terms of religion, but we do see in the city that particularly traditional Orthodox faiths have less leeway in terms of the sort of expressions that sexuality is allowed to have in the public sphere, whether that be the sort of art museum exhibit of male nudes, or I would argue connected to the current state of policing public sex in local parks.
Excellent. So in terms of this topic then, what caught your eye and what made you think, do you know what, there's a research gap here and I'm interested because of ABCD? What got you into this research? Because it's quite interesting. I think it's interesting, personally.
I do as well.
You can't use my words.
So I actually started this project when I was taking an ethnography research course with my advisor, Erin Casanova. Originally, I was going to just do a sort of throwaway project that I wasn't going to really use anything for. And then the sort of second week into the course, when we were like, okay, you have to pick your field sites, the local newspaper published an article sort of listing the arrests of, I think, 5 or 6 men in a city park who were caught cruising during undercover police operations. And I was a sexuality scholar, right, during that class. So I'm like, oh no, this is something of interest to me that actually speaks to the work that I care about. It connects my interest in public expressions of sexuality, sexual identity and practices, and how those are in many ways marginalized in society. So I was like, this has to be the project.
Yes.
So I went and began conducting field work for the course, visiting these sites, seeing what I would see there. And then I decided, yeah, this is the project that has to be my dissertation. There was so much happening at that moment, and so much continuing still, that it was such a rich site for inquiry. And there was not much research done on cruising since the 90s. We have a lot of work that covers the range from the 70s to the 80s. That span is pretty well covered. There was another resurgence of the work in the 90s. And there's a few articles that come out every so often in the 2000s, but they typically were just covering, and this is sort of true of all the research thus far, they focus on the experiences of the men who are cruising and not, in my opinion, the whole social context. At least they hadn't since the late 60s, early 70s. So I wanted to recontextualize what cruising looked like. I wanted to focus on how are police officers surveilling this and how do they think about it? And that's a future avenue for the study, is to actually interview police and other people who are responsible for surveillance and administering the punishments for engaging in this behavior. I wanted to get a full picture of what's going on, not just the viewpoint from the person who is engaging in cruising and public sex.
That is quite interesting, and I guess, you know, hopefully when you finish this part, you'll be looking for somebody else to finish off your research with. So someone who's at home there who's thinking, how can I join in? Work on your proposal. But in terms of your research then, you've explained that you were working on ethnographic research, and then you've, you know, to start, or basically to gauge and to pilot to see if there was a research gap, you went there to those places, which is partially still ethnographic research because you did observe and you didn't engage, but you were observing. So your methodology for your research then, what have you chosen and why?
Yeah, so this is actually the interesting question, because the project now is not an ethnography. So originally it was supposed to be. I wanted to go to these sites, observe to the extent deemed appropriate by the university and sort of general research ethics to see what's actually going on here. How do police surveil these activities? How do those who are cruising navigate that sort of social scene to both find sexual partners and avoid police activity? And then how do people who are visiting these settings, who are not cruisers nor police, recognize, if they even do recognize that? So that was the plan. I got a research fellowship to do that for a year. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So I was no longer able to conduct any sort of field work. It was prohibited universally across the university that that sort of ethnographic field research, being on-site, interacting with people, was a health risk. And it was. So it's an understandable thing. So I had to drastically reshape the project on a year where I was funded to do research. So I thought, okay, well, one thing we need to know is, what is the historical context of cruising in the city? What has it looked like before now to understand what it looks like today? So the first thing I did was a historical comparative analysis of newspaper articles in local and regional newspapers that covered cruising. I think at the moment I have about 144. A recent spark has just happened again in the paper, so my in is constantly updating in my sample.
Yeah. Everyone's out now.
Yes. So I have a collection of newspaper articles, about 150 for the sake of rounding numbers, but from beginning in 1964, going through these, coding them for themes, seeing what is sort of available. How are police talking about cruising when they're quoted in articles? How do journalists frame cruising? How do they understand public sex? And how do they present it as a social problem? And I'm sort of doing that over time. And I see shifts, and we can talk about this, I assume, in a little bit, shifts from the 60s through the 80s, differences in the 90s and the 2000s through today. The framing fundamentally shifts of what people understand that social problem of cruising and public sex to be. The second part of the project is an analysis of, because I needed to know sort of how do cruisers navigate this sort of social scene where they're both seeking sexual partners and also avoiding police activity. So I can't talk to them. So I went to an online forum where men reach out to arrange these sort of sexual encounters. Or at least discuss them, say, hey, I'm going to be at this place at this time. Bringing this sort of digital world.
Craigslist?
Craigslist was once a site that I used because of some laws in the United States. You're actually no longer able to advertise for sexual encounters, which is sort of a separate issue that has ruined one other research project I was working on, but that's a problem for another time.
That's a story for another day.
Precisely. Yes, I can't say what website, again, because of my agreement with the University IRB, it is, I don't want to draw more attention to the people who are of my research study than they would normally receive. So that will remain hidden with me. I call the app as a pseudonym Cruise with a Z as a pun on the various Tinder grinders and whatever. But yeah, that's the second part, is seeing how these men talk about cruising, how they understand it, how they arrange it, and how they discuss policing on the site. Data for those two are collected, and then I have a future project that I plan to start in a few months, where I am going to seek out interviews with those who are responsible for surveilling public sex, whether those be police, park rangers, janitors who have to report or clean up after the fact, and all sorts of other people. And then if I am able to do research interviews in person, because I don't really want a digital trail, I will start recruiting cruisers to sort of talk to me about their experiences, why they cruise, how they cruise, and how they avoid sort of consequences of being caught cruising. So yes, there's the 3 steps of the project in my mind.
I'm excited. I'm thinking you should write a book, because I think it'd be really interesting.
I too would like to write a book. That is the goal.
But going back to what you've just said, I wanted to understand what cruising's definition is for your research, and then also the external, in terms of the men who participate in these activities, or women actually who participate. I don't know if you've got women as well in these activities, but if it's mainly male, what is the definition?
Yeah, probably should have started with this now that I'm thinking about it. So cruising describes the social practices as emerges in the sort of 1920s and 30s within sort of gay communities, or men who have sex with men who really couldn't express their sexuality in a homophobic society, right? Yeah. So there was no option to seek out sexual partners in the sort of traditional avenues, whether that be at work, you have a friend introduce you to another friend, right? Because there were severe social penalties to being gay or being perceived as gay. So cruising emerges as a way for men to find sexual partners in public spaces. It often involves nonverbal communication, so lingering eye contact, just piercing gaze that would make other people uncomfortable. Precisely. Other people would be uncomfortable and look away, but those who are cruising know, I'm picking up on picking up what's being put down, to say.
Yeah.
In sort of other venues, like public restrooms, people will sometimes tap their foot under the stall, signaling a sort of interest. And if the other person taps back, that also sort of communicates that. And there's this whole nonverbal language around how to signal your sexual interest for people who participate. So that's sort of fundamentally what cruising is the sort of social practices men use to signal their sexual attraction to other men and to engage in sexual activity. Sometimes this remains in public places like public restrooms or city parks, and other times this can go to other places, whether that be a hotel room or a private residence.
That is quite interesting. So now I'm thinking, if it's nonverbal, you would never know if you're sat in a restaurant and, you know, people can communicate and, you know, go and do whatever they need to do. So in terms of the nonverbal communication then, is it different for different ethnic groups, or is it the same and is standard and is uniform? And can it be applied from a global perspective in a different part of the world? Or is it just...
Yeah, I think this is a particularly interesting question. My research and most of the research that I tend to engage with is focused on the American context. So I imagine there are, right, it's reasonable to assume that in societies that still have high degrees of cultural homophobia with severe social punishments, that we would expect to see cruising happening, right, just on sort of the basic biological and social urge to connect and engage in sexual activity. So I imagine there are similarities, right? I imagine there are still a lot of nonverbal cues, right? Because it allows you to be safe. It allows you to back out of an encounter or push something off if it doesn't work exactly how you're thinking, right? You could think someone's cruising you, but really they could be about to like assault you, right? So the ability to quickly back out because you haven't committed verbally to any sort of thing allows you to do that more easily. I do think, I don't think there are differences in at least my sample based on race or ethnicity. What I would say is age is a key factor in thinking about this, right?
Okay.
So the men who originally sort of are brought up in an environment that is still homophobic, right? Those who are growing up in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s have a, I don't want to say better because there's not sort of a judgment, but have a safer, perhaps, use of nonverbal communication.
Okay.
So because they understand that, oh, actually speaking can get you caught, whereas younger men who have not participated in the sort of extreme social homophobia of the 70s and 80s, who don't have that experience, are much more likely to use sort of verbal cues. At least this is sort of an observation, not necessarily strict pattern of behavior that I've noted. But it does seem that younger men are just less accustomed to what we might think of as traditional cruising practices, those that are primarily nonverbal and sort of non-committal. They're much more willing to speak, sometimes disrupting encounters, I find.
That is fascinating. I'm just thinking, in terms of trends in employment, they've always said, millennials, we don't last for too long. If there's a problem, oh, I'm gone, kind of thing. And it's quite interesting to hear that even with cruising over the years, those behaviors, dependent on the culture of that generation, they behave accordingly, even if it's something that's still risky, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, precisely.
That is interesting anyway to me in terms of that. So in terms of the police then, what is their definition of cruising?
Right. So in terms of policing, we very, very rarely see words used like cruising or public sex, the sort of language that I frame it as, and those who are participating in the community would use as well. And right, that makes sense because they're coming from a legal framework, not necessarily one of a practitioner or, in my instance, a sexuality scholar. So what we see primarily discussed are instances of public indecency, right? So being nude or engaging in lewd activity in public places, and in some instances, sexual solicitation, particularly when cruisers attempt to cruise undercover police officers.
That's a slippery slope, isn't it, that one?
Yes, and that's sort of the primarily mechanism, at least that is used here, that we see arrests happening, is that someone is soliciting sex from an undercover officer who then, it's unclear what the sort of strategies and training that they use are. The newspapers don't report it, the police don't really talk about it publicly. So that's something I do want to hammer in on when or if I'm able to talk to police, if they are so willing to speak to me, is what actually are the practices used. In some instances, particularly through the 80s, we see allegations of police entrapment. And even recently, coverage discusses, or people who are arrested allege that police themselves pretend to be engaged in sexual behavior, luring people into the encounter. So it's unclear whether or not that's true based on the evidence that's available. There have been some court cases that have attempted to adjudicate that and some shifting of police policy based on that in the 80s. But the actual mechanisms that undercover officers use, the strategies are, as of yet, I think, unclear, besides in the abstract. But yeah, fundamentally, for police, at least how they discuss it, it's a matter of their legal necessity to enforce the law. However, in some interviews, even recently with a president of a local police union, we still see this language used, though, where these parks are a place for families and they shouldn't have to see this, right? That's not a legal argument. That's a moral one. So behind the sort of legal frameworks that are used when charging men who have sex with men, I call this idea moral policing, where officers are acting as moral agents and attempting to enforce a set standard of what is appropriate sexuality in public space. Right, we can argue, and I'm sure other people would argue, that cruising in public sex is immoral or not, depending on the sort of social context and where it's happening and how it's happening. That's not necessarily an argument I'm particularly interested in having. What interests me is, how do officers use this sort of legal framework to present themselves as neutral authorities who are enforcing the law, and on the back end also talk about themselves or present their work as moral agents who are enforcing dominant heteronormative social standards, particularly targeting, at least as I'm seeing it, men who have sex with men.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry to interject, but that's why I was asking about religion, because I feel when it comes to morals, you know, religion drives what we see as norm or what we see as isn't, if you understand what I mean. And based on what you've just said there, it seems as if they're leaning on religion rather than leaning on the law, in a sense, because now the same genders can get married. So there's a movement in terms of awareness and where we're going as a global community. Now same sexes can have children. So therefore, when it comes to cruising, I'm just thinking in my head, is it more of the religious background, or is it more of we want to maintain what has always been there in terms of culture, and we don't want it to change, and therefore we'll enforce and go undercover to push our agenda?
Yeah, well, I think this is an interesting question. No one invokes religion in their responses. In many ways, it would be inappropriate to do so for an officer to invoke, I am enforcing the law because of my religious beliefs. That's a little suspicious, and at the very least in a liberal democracy, right? I think the core idea, the core value that is being placed here is that public space exists for the heteronormative family union, right? A married husband and wife and their 2.5 kids. That is what public space primarily exists for their consumption, for their enjoyment, and any activity that sort of deviates from that, whether that be, in my instance, cruising or public sex, sex work and prostitution, homelessness and vagrancy, public intoxication, or urination, things like that, right? All of those become problematic because they threaten, whether that threat is real or imagined, this unit that we imagine is the core foundation of society, right? I think there are many religious connections that one can make. There are many social connections that one can make about why that unit is of the most social importance, particularly I think in the United States. But I think at the core of it, it is about who is public space for. That's families with their children, and anything that could possibly ever threaten that, anything that they could see, even if they would never see it, even if they never know about it until they read about arrests in the paper, has to be targeted.
Okay. So this brings me on to, I think I said this before we started, which was cruising the Queen City.
Yes.
I think that is genius. So
I am very proud of it.
So do you want to explain what that is to the audience? Then I'll crack on with the questions.
Yeah, so it's unfortunately a rather mundane answer. So Cincinnati, Ohio is referred to colloquially as the Queen City. It's sort of a nickname that was given to it by people in the 1800s, calling it sort of the Queen of the West, right? This sort of city that is beautiful, dignified, not as important as the capital, of course, but still an important city nonetheless, a sort of crown jewel of cities. So fundamentally, the Queen City is that. It's just a term that describes Cincinnati. But right, there's a little play on words here. Right, cruising, because it's an activity that emerges from gay communities and men who have sex with men. So right, another colloquial term there for men who have sex with men or gay men is a queen, right? So we can use this sort of play on words here to see how do we have this idea of how does one cruise the Queen City, both in perspective of in the locale that is Cincinnati, and also as someone, as people who are men who have sex with men, right? So there's sort of a double encoded meaning into the word queen that I think is sort of just foundational. It's a pun for me. I'm a fan of pithy titles.
No, I love it. I love it. So I guess in my head, before reading everything, when I read the title, I'm thinking, okay, Elton John. I'm like, that's where I am. I'm excited already in that sense. And I understand in terms of play on words, but the message behind it is quite important, as you've just said, in terms of from when we started talking. So in terms of your research then, when you finish and you've got this title, are you thinking to expand? I don't know, a lot of states in the US, so I'll just name a few, maybe to the ATL or maybe Texas or New York. Is your research applicable in terms of the framework? Would it be applicable, or is it just applicable to Cincinnati? Did I say that right?
Yeah, I think one of the good things about sociology is that it is a science of comparison. So right now, right, I'm comparing the past to the present. But right, you can also compare different local contexts. And I think fundamentally, that is something that I will be interested in doing. This is sort of a first step into seeing how does it work here? So I have some sort of baselines, developing these methods, honing in on the research questions and what they precisely need to be. And then expanding that outward. A lot of research on cruising focuses on large, what we call the great American cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, and others. I don't want to focus on these places. These are places that we know so much about already that more research is a grain of sand on an endless beach in some ways. I want to know about places we don't talk about. I want to know about cities, suburbs, and rural areas that are much less examined. Mansfield, Ohio, for instance, I know has a case where police officers put recording devices hidden in public restrooms to find people who are engaging in sexual activity. This just came up as I was doing my research. This was in, I think, the 70s. Huge lawsuit, quite obviously. But that's a rich site that is, I imagine, quite under-examined in the discipline and in studies in general, because we don't consider it one of these crown jewels of American urban studies. I'm interested in looking at different places. I have colleagues doing work in a variety of places, so not identical to mine, but they touch on work that speaks to it. For instance, during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we see a lot of discussion. I'm thinking about LA has one, I think with some city in Wisconsin, Los Angeles, and then Wisconsin has another instances where we see public officials shutting down bathhouses that are used for cruising and public sexual activity in the sort of name of public health and preventing the spread of the HIV/AIDS virus. That does not occur in my data at all. So the lack of that says something fundamentally important about what we think of as the problem, right? If we don't care about gay men contracting HIV or men who have sex with men contracting HIV and AIDS in this city, why is that the case?
Why is that?
And I think the only way we find that out is by comparing it to other cities, whether those be nearby cities or those in different states, those in different countries even. And I think the usefulness of this project is a framework for thinking about how can we identify the history of cruising in a given area and the current practices of cruising and the surveillance of it in a given area, and transport that to different places and compare those to see how things are different and begin to theorize why that might be the case.
Okay, so you know how before you did mention about the trends that you've identified. So what are the top 3 trends that you've picked up on that you think would be quite interesting to share with the wider audience that we can discuss from your research?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the interesting things I find we've sort of touched on this already, is that police have two frameworks when discussing policing, what we might think of as a neutral policing framework and then moral policing framework. And despite that, right, we see that framework employed in the past and in the present. And that sort of leads into the second point, is that prior to the late 80s, early 90s, near universally, all coverage of public sex understood it as a, in quotes, right, homosexual problem. The problem with cruising and public sex is that homosexuals are going into public space and misusing it for their deviant sexual practices. It was a problem with their identity, who they are as people. Right? Today, we might look at that as somewhat problematic, I imagine, right? Blaming the activities of a small subset of a group and extrapolating that to the entire group. And as time progresses through the 90s, right, we begin to see journalists pushing back on that framework a little bit. But we also begin to see community members pushing back, organizing after arrests. There was a series of arrests in a city park that sparked, I think, 40 to 50 arrests of men in a week, which is quite excessive for criminal activity. That these local gay activists in the 80s organized a picnic in the park to say, actually, this is our space. You can't just come in here and arrest anyone. They were alleging that some men who were being arrested were just holding hands or kissing in public. So the degree, again, to that, what that is true is lost to time, unfortunately. The coverage does not specify, and we don't have any oral histories of the time to sort of give us that context. But what we see, I think, because of this pushback is a transition from, oh, it's not the homosexual that's the problem, but rather the practice and the place it happens. So we see a shift from sexual identity being the problem to a place-based problem organized around deviant sexual behavior. The mere notion of mentioning that someone even could possibly be gay almost vanishes from the research, except it wiggles itself in strategic ways to keep it up. So we see police and local residents and journalists, for instance, invoking this idea of, right, well, a child could be sexually assaulted. We know from cruising research, not just my own and near universally, that men who engage in cruising and public sex are terrified of encountering children, right? Because they don't want to be, one, they do not want to even have the potential for that sort of sexual encounter, given the sort of extreme illegal nature of it. But also, right, they're not looking to get caught. They aren't usually, right, exhibitionists trying to have sex right out where anyone can see it. It's about the hidden nature of cruising. So that said, right, police, media, and local residents who comment still invoke this idea of the child predator, which is a foul stigma that's attached to gay men historically. We can see that in a lot of different settings of research as well. And they'll also mention things like, well, you know, they use Grindr to arrange these encounters. So the invocation of apps that are designed for men who have sex with men to meet for social and sexual behavior. So despite the sort of abandoning of mentioning people's sexual identities in favor of stigmatizing those sexual practices, we still see gayness and gay identity invoked sort of through the backdoor approach. So while it, again, appears to be neutral, it's engaging in a sort of moralism. It's just much harder to identify now for the sort of layman or average reader. I'm not sure if that was 1, 2, or 3 points.
Quite interesting. I think an element of safety, you know, is the main theme, like to drive, you know, the force behind it in terms of policing.
Elevated, now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go.